All right, now we're going to get started. I provided you with a base mesh. You can see that included with your file materials, and it's a super simple guy. So now we're going to just go over quick proportions and kind of go over what what you need to keep in mind when you start your figure. So here's the guy. We're going to make sure that we're on centimeters, and we're actually going to be 1/10 scale. And I'm using Anatomy Next to show you 7.5 heads high. We're going to convert 5 feet 5 inches to decimeters, and that's what that measurement is. So my unit of measurement is 10 centimeters. So I'm dividing that into 7.5 pieces so I can make my 7.5 heads mark and kind of line up those bits. And there's a really nice head unit of measurement to try to space out each part of the proportions of the human figure. The three bigger masses: skull, rib cage, and pelvis. So I'm just using box modeling to measure all of these different elements to make sure that I'm not too far off. Dividing things into 10 units makes it easier to snap and to measure based on 1.2 head units. You know, if you divide it by 10, you can easily get a 0.2 measurement from that cube or that head size. So that's what I'm doing for each bit. And I want to make sure that they're angled, and I'm just trying to make sure that my landmarks are in the right spots according to the landmark map. Now I'm going to export my base mesh, groups turned off, as an OBJ. And I like to start with a star to make sure that I start with perfect symmetry. And then I will append another star and then import my body. And I'll turn symmetry on. And also I want to export my proportions chart, just so we can always have that around in case I need to double check my work. So now I'm just going to go ahead and sculpt from my Anatomy Next reference to try to nail, you know, the major land masses of the body. So I'm just, you know, thickening areas with the inflate brush, making sure to match, you know, a lot of the angles. Oh, and I'm also using poly grouping to make sure that my polygroups are easily accessible per body part. And you use a Control-Shift drag to hide everything but selected. And then you can use Control-Shift-X to grow your selection. So I'm just matching angles. Keeping my, it's really important to make sure that you keep your base mesh fairly low during this process. You know, I'm only dividing it a few times right now while I'm getting all my landmarks in. It really helps to make sure that you're not going too high too soon. You don't want to be distracted by details when there's a lot more important things to take note of, and people lose sight of that quickly. All right, just laying in some more body landmarks. I'm trying to make sure my A pose is working, keeping in mind that there is a mass for the rib cage and there's a mass for the pelvis, and that's what I'm marking here. Adding some volume to the butt, and just trying to keep that angled shape in the rib cage versus the pelvis. That's really important. you know, drawing in some of the breast mass and keeping in mind that eventually the breast mass will be fitting inside a brassiere. So I'm not going to make them look super, natural, like a live nude model would have. Just make them a little bit higher than they'd normally go to make it look like there's clothing underneath. Just double checking that my sacral triangle is put in the right spot. My scapula is another landmark that's really important. You know, just making sure that all these areas are scribed in. And I'm going through all those brushes just like I had showed you before, using my hotkeys and making sure that, that I'm as loose as possible right now with my sculpting. I'm not being super specific. I'm just plotting in areas that I know need to be there. And something I like to do is, not only use photo reference for your bodies, but I also use, I've been using scan reference lately. If you go on various scan websites, 1024, 3D Digital Doubles, places like that, you can find some really nice scans of real human bodies with a ZBrush matte cap on top, so you can see what the lighting is supposed to do on a completely gray shaded model. Sometimes I get overwhelmed with texture and skin color. You know, sometimes in specular highlight, sometimes it gets overwhelming. So I'm just reinforcing my rib cage here, making sure that my abdominal pad is filled in enough. And I'm just triple checking silhouette stuff, making sure that, all these different angles are met and that they make sense. Just putting in a basic skull here. Now I'm going to attack the knee area. Put in some sartorius, ankles, running up the quads, the gluteus maximus, hamstring muscles, getting that nice H shape in there. I like to scribe in my muscles much like an écorché first, so I know where my muscles start and where they end. It's really important to keep that in mind while you're sculpting. Adding in some shapes for my quad muscles and for my IT band, the inner part of my leg, ankles, all these bits. All right, now I'm gonna just quickly focus for a small time on the toes to just try to get something that doesn't look cartoonish. I like looking at Philippe Farreau sculptures. He has really great looking reference for what feet and hands should look like sculpturally. And he kind of breaks it down in a really nice way. So I kind of always start with that for hands and feet to make sure that all my primitive shapes are working the way they should. And, taking note of where your skeleton is underneath is always important. That'll really inform the rest of your sculpture, to be aware of that. All right, now I'm going to scribe in the muscles for the arm. Get those triceps in there. Build up mass for the deltoid, for the bicep, for the bridge group. Divide that up. For the bridge group, the flexor and extensor group. For more information on that, definitely check out Anatomy for Sculptors or any other anatomy reference. When you're studying anatomy, especially for harder areas like the forearms and the bottoms of the legs, the best way I can tell you that I learned was figuring out the main primitive shape and then where it starts and where it ends. So if your forearm starts, where that shape starts and where does it end on the wrist. That's the biggest, most important thing, especially in a female arm. You want to understand what those shapes are. You don't necessarily have to know their names or memorize all kinds of digit, muscle, flexor digitorum names and stuff like that. As long as you're aware of where they start and where they end, you should be okay. All right, now I'm just gonna reinforce hand shapes. Make sure that my model's flowing well from the side view. And also take note, I'm not using my perspective on purpose. I don't like using it, especially not at this stage. It really doesn't help. And it kind of distorts the figure. So when you bring it back into Maya, it might look different than what you expect. Also, we're going for a pretty symmetrical looking model. So I want my symmetry to keep from the side. So I know it's going to be perfectly flat. All right, now I'm going to start scribing in some mass on the fingers and the hands, making sure the proportions are correct, making sure there's volume, and I'm just kind of scribing in, making sure the silhouette looks right. Hands take a while to learn, but I kind of, I just kind of learn by doing. So the more that you do, the better you're going to get, and then you'll start seeing patterns that you can use over and over again for each new hand that you sculpt. And right now I'm just making sure that it looks right and that fat's going where fat's supposed to be, and the bone shape underneath the hand is going where it's supposed to be, and the general proportions of my hand are working the way I want. And you got to make sure your hand works with your arm as well. So if it looks a little bit wrong, you're going to want to take care of that. Now I'm just using the move tool and masking to kind of bend my fingers into a nice natural shape. So if you just look at your hand and kind of let it go limp, you can see the kind of shape that I'm going for. Just super relaxed. Now I've up-res the model a bit and I'm smoothing out all that scribe detail. But it's nice because you can still see a lot of that scribed in detail that remains. And then you can use those as landmarks to reinforce some anatomy. So I'm just defining where my elbow goes, redefining some deltoid shapes, quad shapes, ankles and knees, making sure that fat pad's there for a female. Double checking that my silhouette on my shoulders look correct. I use sculpture with light a lot, and it really helps. I also use my background, to note where my silhouette isn't working. And I may change it to be a much lighter color down the line so I can really, really nail the silhouette that I want. Think about it like a drawing. If you're drawing a picture, you don't want all the lines surrounding the drawing to be super squiggly or kind of messy. So that's a lot of what I'm doing, especially when I use big move tools. I'm just fixing my lines on my model. But since it's 3D, you have to do it on all sides. And so now I'm just using the masking tool to mask out some fingernails, get some of the finger joints to work, reinforcing the joints in the fingers. They're going to look a little funky for a second. Just doing the same thing, making a nail bed. If you're confused about how your hands are supposed to look, you have the perfect reference, which is your own hands, that you can look at while you sculpt. And just try to break it down into, what it really looks like. Don't imagine, square or sausage shapes or anything like that. Just take a look and see what shapes are your own hands and what looks right. Making sure that volumes and everything line up as well. Kind of reinforcing all the wrinkles and, where on your palm everything collapses. Making sure to put the ulna, the end of the ulna on the wrist. And I'm just scribing out some of the fat pad wrinkles, the main ones. This one, this one, this one. Reinforcing some of those fat pads on the fingers. Sculpting out the thumbnail. Getting some of the tendons to work. And I'm just making sure everything's looking pretty good. I used to avoid doing parts of the model that I didn't feel comfortable sculpting, and now it's much easier to tackle all of the model at once. It makes you into a better sculptor to not avoid areas like hands and feet, and just, even if it's not 100% the way you like it, at least it looks finished according to the rest of your model. So now I've made my background white so I can see my silhouette better. And I've made my matte cap a little bit darker here, just so I can see it really, really pop out of the silhouette. Reinforcing all those fat pad shapes and all the bony landmarks. Using my special clay tubes brush with a low intensity. And I'm just going over every single muscle with my clay tubes to make sure that the volume is looking the way I want. And I like to do, a sweeping movement across forms. And now I'm just scribing in some serratus on top of the rib cage. Getting some volumes on the gluteus maximus, abdomen, smoothing out some of those areas. Making sure that my landmarks are staying correct. And this is just my next pass, my next phase of detailing, which is just filling in all the same muscles that I've previously indicated in my model and reinforcing their shape, their volume, how they react to light, which parts are the bones. And making sure to blend each shape to the next one. And your model's going to kind of look, what's nice is, your model's going to look as finished as long as you keep the idea of finishing all of your model instead of just pieces. And you say I came this far and I avoided the hands. It wouldn't look quite as finished as it does now because I did spend a little bit of time in the hands. Now I'm just masking out some bikini bottom, just to be easy. It's easy to extract the bikini bottom mesh, and kind of make a quick underpants mesh, just so I can, make sure that my model looks good in an outfit. And also make sure that she looks believable inside the bikini bottom, and that, that the specific landmarks and lines are fitting within that bikini. Now I'm just doing the same thing, using standard special to lightly scribe in, and using clay to go over some forms very lightly, damn standard, to make sure that, the sharper bits of my muscles are being accented. Notice I've made my light to the top left, and that's just so I can make sure that my forms are looking the way I want them to. I'm just getting my tibia working. You really have to be aware of your skeleton at all times. I used to hear it all the time from anatomy teachers. There's something wrong with your skeleton. And I would I'm not sure. I would kind of ignore it and avoid that comment, only because studying the skeleton is rather difficult. But you could not believe how important it is. Every time, since studying the skeleton more, every time there's a big problem, it's usually from the skeleton. And it's so important to pay attention when your teachers tell you that, because they are not lying. It is because you don't understand the skeleton. And in order to get a better understanding of it, it's really helpful to just find landmarks on your own body and draw over, fitness magazines or any kind of, yoga magazine, something like that. If you know where to find each bony landmark, that's a really great start. Then you can go on and figure out where the muscles start and end on the bones. And then you'll just become a superstar. All right, now I'm just reinforcing some back muscle shapes, deltoid, making sure that works, making sure the silhouette works on my arms. Just double checking to make sure I keep refining every area, making sure that it reacts to light in the way that I want it to. And if you're confused about that part, definitely practice sculpting forms, and they could be any kinds of forms. just round to a rigid form in ZBrush or in clay. And if you can get it to do what you want, you basically are able to sculpt anything.